these books featuring every single Super Nintendo game just won't stop coming out. This time, it's the Super Nintendo Anthology from Geeks-Line Publishing. Hi everyone, John here. As promised, I've got more books featuring entire libraries of game consoles to get through and review, including a number of them just for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Here's another one. No, it's not deja vu. Besides looking at books at the Super NES before, we've also previously looked at some anthology books from Geeks-Line Publishing. I've reviewed their GameCube Anthology and their Nintendo 64 Anthology books earlier, and this one is the Super Nintendo Anthology. I absolutely loved reading the other anthology books, and I love the Super NES, probably my favorite game console. So does this mean that this is a shoo-in for the greatest book ever? Let's find out. To be more accurate, this anthology is comprised of 2 books. While the other anthologies included a second volume featuring box art, this time around, the anthology features 2 separate books, one titled Software and one titled Hardware. The software one is, of course, a look at all the games available for the Super NES, as well as the Japanese Super Famicom. The volume titled Hardware, unsurprisingly, breaks down the hardware of the console, as well as a look at controllers and other accessories, though it also details the entire development of the console, its history, and other things like advertising and box art. So there's still lots to read here, even if you're not a technical sort of person. Let's start with a look at the software book, the book that reviews every 16-bit Nintendo game. And it really does. Besides just reviewing every Super NES game released in North America, it also reviews every European Super NES game, and every Japanese Super Famicom game. Seeing as how Japan got 1,440 games, twice than North America did, the bulk of this is unfamiliar territory, even to a North American gamer like myself. Now, here in the Americas, it's generally accepted that we have 718, 720, or 721 official cartridge releases, depending on how you want to count them. But this book opens with a pie chart showing North America with 739 games. I don't know how they came up with this number, even going so far as to flip through every page to count them. No easy task, since all games, regardless of region, are mixed together as opposed to separating them by region. Now, take note, this book is indeed about software, as in it reviews games, not cartridges. And yes, there is an important distinction here. If games were released under different names or bundled together, they don't get another entry here, even though in other books they would. So Super Copa is not here on its own, but Tony Meola's Sidekick Soccer, oddly listed under S, not T, of which it is a reskin of, is here. Chave and Chave 2 are not here by themselves, but they are reskins of Riddick Bowe Boxing and Boxing Legends of the Ring, which are here. Cannondale Cup is not here, but Exertainment Mountain Bike Rally is. And also on that note, this book does not have separate entries for combo cartridges, like the 2-in-1 for Exertainment Mountain Bike Rally and Speed Racer in My Most Dangerous Adventures, or the re-release of Super Mario All-Stars that adds Super Mario World to the remakes of the NES games. So, because of that, you would actually expect to see fewer than 721 entries, not more. But this book includes Star Fox 2, which was originally unreleased, but came out in 2017 on the Super NES Classic Edition, yet not on an official cartridge for use on an original Super NES. Then it erroneously lists Barbie Vacation Adventure as released, but though the Genesis version was released, the Super NES one was cancelled, and also mistakenly lists the European game Winter Gold as North American. But even though we shouldn't, even adding these still doesn't get us near the 739 in its pie chart. So, in all this confusion, I had to make up a spreadsheet comparing this and all the other Super NES books I am reviewing to make sure that this book at least reviews every regular official North American game, and I can confirm that it does. Super Noah's Ark 3D gets a mention, not in the main review section, but in the aftermarket section. I do prefer this separation, unlike other books that list this one unlicensed Super NES game along the licensed games. Another note, we probably all know Final Fantasy II in the West as the localized version of the Japanese Final Fantasy IV, but there are enough differences for this book to list them as 2 separate games. This is not the case with Final Fantasy III, the original localized version of Final Fantasy VI. Despite some changes, they are listed together as Final Fantasy III. Hence, the main numbered Final Fantasy games are listed here as 2, 4, 5, and 3. I'll do a formal comparison of all the different Super NES books later, but I can say right now that a distinct advantage the Super Nintendo Anthology has over other books is featuring every Japanese game, at least as far as I can tell. This is a huge deal, as nothing else I've read so far is so thorough. There are definitely some standouts, like 3 Japanese exclusive Goemon games that all have 5-star reviews. Why wouldn't these awesome Legend of the Mystical Ninja sequels come out here too? Then there are the ones based on anime or manga that aren't really known in the West, like all these Nintama Rantaro and SD Gundam games. But for every one of those, there's like a dozen Mahjong, Pachinko, and Shogi games. Being this comprehensive is a good thing, as it is essentially an encyclopedia. But since I have to read every word in a book before I give it a review, I did find it wearying to read so much about seemingly endless gambling games. On the other hand, by having so many games, it's not hard to see that this is where we have one of the major cons. Despite looking neat and tidy with the anthology books thus far being about the same size, the actual sizes of each console's game libraries are so different. With less than 400 games across all the regions for the Nintendo 64 and about 650 for the GameCube, those books had pages that usually had 2 to 4 decent-sized reviews, with multiple screenshots and some trivia. And these are even with very lengthy introductions within the same book. The Super Nintendo Anthology saves the preliminary history lessons for the hardware book, so the software book can jump right into it. But even so, with around 1700 games to cover, we're seeing up to 8 reviews per page. That is way too many. As always, the standard iconic games get more space, up to a page all to themselves, but everything else is essentially relegated to only a paragraph and 1 or 2 very tiny screenshots. Even when there wasn't much to say for a Nintendo 64 or GameCube game in their anthologies, there was trivia or at least larger screenshots. The short reviews here lack the space to really say anything significant, such as elaborating on their scores. Sometimes games are described positively, yet get a low score. Why? We'll never know. Quite ironically, Best of the Best Championship Karate gets the worst possible score, a 0 out of 5, worse than even the infamous Shaq Fu. To make matters worse, 0 is an incredibly rare score in this book. I actually enjoyed the PC version of Best of the Best, and I know others have rated this much higher, so I would like to know what justifies this. But there just isn't the space for a deeper explanation of the score, other than just saying the combat is appallingly portrayed. Even generic shogi games seem to average 2 stars. But even without comparing it to previous books in the anthology series that had set the bar so high, it's still a little disappointing. While it's a great thing that the Super NES and Super Famicom were so popular as to have so many games, a book reviewing them all should be able to say at least a little more. Okay, maybe not for the Mahjong and Shogi, but certainly Shadowrun deserves better. Even if larger reviews meant making this book considerably larger than the other anthology books, or requiring a second volume, making this cost twice as much, personally, I would have been fine with that. When reviews are different sizes, it is understandable to have to shuffle some entries around to get them to fit nicely on the page, so sometimes, alphabetically, it can be slightly off. But this book has many alphabetization issues. When I look on pages 16 and 17, I don't understand why Aerobiz, Aero the Acrobat, and Albert Odyssey are listed after their sequels, especially in the case of the first two, where those reviews and the ones around them are all the same size. Even when they do seem to be in order, it's not consistent whether they are in order column by column or row by row. Pages 220 and 221 are weird too. You go down the first column, then zigzag back and forth between the second and third columns across the center, and then go down the fourth? What? Any book that can be used as an encyclopedia should also be arranged as such. I wonder if the butchered alphabetization might be a result of bad translation. There are certainly many remnants of translations from French, often in the header box. I could find many instances of the number of players being un ou deux instead of 1 or 2. Several have release dates in Octobre instead of October. Page 28 oddly says text japonais for many entries, when all other headers don't even mention anything about language. Despite the book's prioritization of North America, there are some instances of things that weren't localized, like Blackthorn being listed under its European name Blackhawk, Kirby's Avalanche referred to in its text as Kirby's Ghost Trap, and Animaniac's Pinky and the Brain being referred to as Minus and Cortex. One of the biggest mistranslations is when courses are referred to as racings. I noticed this in Parodius, PGA European Tour, PGA Tour Golf, PGA Tour 96, Pilot Wings, Tommy Moe's Winter Extreme Skiing and Snowboarding, True Golf Classics, YLA Country Club, Wicket 18, and World Masters Golf. Oddly confirmed in the entries for Sailor Moon, Super Street Fighter 2, and Wario's Woods, where they meant to say, of course, but say, of racing. I noticed some errors with licensed games, suggesting an unfamiliarity with the source material. The Death and Return of Superman is said to be based on a DC animated movie arc, which is not accurate. Both are based on the original comics. Also, they say Crypt, when they surely meant Krypton. The Hunt for Red October refers to a character as Sam Ryan, when the character should be Jack Ryan. The Lawnmower Man sounds like it may be incorrectly referring to the protagonist as Job, who is actually the antagonist. Other errors include Dai-3Jai Super Robot Taisen is mistakenly given the same description as Daibakusho Jinsei Gekijo. Kido Senshi Gundam Cross Dimension 0079 is incomplete. The game system is finally... Light Fantasy 2 has the same box and screenshot as the original. Mega Man 7 mentions a Super Famicom game follow-up, but gives it a half Japanese and half English name, Rockman and Bass, instead of saying Rockman and Forte or Mega Man and Bass. Street Fighter 2's entry refers to fighters' history for the story of the lawsuit that allows many fighting games to exist, except that the Fighter's History Review makes no mention of it. The entry for Super Mario All-Stars erroneously says the NES version of Super Mario Bros. 3 has a battery backup, uses the same screenshot twice, and says faint-hearted using faint with an E, which is incorrect. Tommy Moe's Winter Extreme is listed under T for Tommy, but Tony Miola's Sidekick Soccer is listed under S for Sidekicks. Why is there an inconsistency with how they handle names? So, I know I got nitpicky there, but I didn't actually mention every error I found. Honestly, someone should just hire me as a proofreader. After getting through all the official releases, the software book has a whopping 16 pages of information and screenshots on cancelled games, which I thought was rather impressive, considering the Super NES was mostly before the internet era. The book ends with a look at some unlicensed games. Unlike other anthology books, there is no checklist here for collectors. Now the hardware book is really something else. Besides just a detailed technical look at the Super NES, the hardware book gets into its history and legacy, and then controllers and accessories, and then interviews, bundles, box art, and advertising. The first quarter of the book is titled The SNES Epic, and starts with the history of how the Super Famicom and Super NES came to be. When reviewing Geeks-Line Publishing's previous anthology books for the GameCube and Nintendo 64, I remarked how detailed and thoroughly they covered the origin stories of those consoles, with lots of images and insider information. In those cases, the age of the internet was already upon us, and so they expanded on the narratives I remembered from following their development back in the day. But the Super NES was being designed years before the internet was a common thing, so despite the Super NES being my favorite console, I really didn't know much about its development outside of the tiny scraps of info that magazines like Nintendo Power and GamePro dropped at the time, and for whatever reason never looked into it later. In any case, it's all here in this book, or at least the most comprehensive recap that I've ever seen for this machine. The history here actually goes back even before my parents were born, to 1949, when Hiroshi Yamauchi, Nintendo's infamous and longest running president, took over Nintendo, transitioning it away from just making card games. Despite having repeatedly read about the history of the company of Nintendo in other books, it's an easy read here with its numerous images to go along with all of the thorough detail. And if you didn't already know about Nintendo's history, including the Out Your Hand, arcade machines, and Game & Watch, this is a good overview. Then when it gets near the Super Famicom, which is the focus of course, we're seeing prototypes. Wow, check out those C and D buttons. Concept art, tech demos, photos of press events, and reading about what the press, public, and the competition thought about the Super NES. After its release, the book continues to follow the 16-bit war, further developments like the Super FX chip and the partnership with Rare, and the rise of the next generation. Then we get to the actual hardware in this hardware book. There's a lot of comparison with other consoles, including this technical comparison chart of how the Super NES looks next to other game consoles of that era, from its predecessor, the Famicom, up to the arcade-perfect Neo Geo. Before you get turned away by all these images of chips, let me point out that I'm not a technical sort of guy, but I did not struggle to read through this book. Further explanations about graphics fascinated me, and sound as well, as the Super NES is known for its music, and both again, with comparison tables. The special chips included in some cartridges that provided certain games with extra functions that couldn't be done with the basic hardware turned out to be more interesting than I initially thought they would. I knew there was more out there than just the Super FX chip, like the CX4 chip used in Mega Man X2 and 3, but I didn't know there were this many. Did you know that the most powerful chip, the STO-18, was used for artificial intelligence in just one shogi game? Maybe it's not vital information, but it makes for some interesting trivia. Starting off the second half of the book is the accessories section. We see the regional versions of the main console, official cables and controllers, including the Super Scope and the Super NES mouse. There are 7 pages on Satellaview, a Japanese expansion that allowed the Super Famicom to download data via satellite. This meant digital games, demos, and DLC in the 16-bit era. Fascinating stuff, as much of it is inaccessible now. The Classic Edition or mini versions from 2017 get a mention, as well as the Nintendo Super System, an arcade cabinet meant to showcase Super NES games. Then we get into lots of third-party controllers and accessories. Wireless controllers, one-handed controllers, arcade sticks, and more are pretty much expected, but there's also the Barcode Battler, which reads barcodes, a golf club accessory long before the Wii, and a controller with a keypad that was specifically for betting on horses in actual horse races in Japan. Now the Miracle Piano Teaching System's full keyboard doesn't seem so crazy compared to those. One odd thing about the accessory section of the hardware book is the lack of a mention of the Game Genie. Such a weird oversight considering they did mention the Pro Action Replay, so why would they exclude the better known cheat accessory? And another gripe is the exclusion of the North American Super Game Boy. The South Korean Super Mini Comboy is shown, as is the improved version, the Japanese Super Game Boy 2. I thought the Super Game Boy accessory was major enough, like the main console and the controller, to warrant showing regional variants. Then there's 5 pages on the Nintendo PlayStation, intended to be a CD-ROM drive for the Super NES. We all know what happened to that in general, but the details are covered very well here. Next are the interviews, including one with Dylan Cuthbert, whose work led to the creation of the Super FX chip, allowing for the Super NES to handle polygons and hence the creation of the Star Fox franchise. Then there's an interview with Melvoot Dinch, who goes into detail about designing games like Street Racer. I recall I may have dumped on Street Racer before, but now I have a greater appreciation for the game on a technical level, which was able to pull off 4 players racing simultaneously without the need for extra chips, whereas the similar Super Mario Kart actually did require a chip to assist it with only 2 players. Random quotes from other developers in this section. For collectors, there's a look at some special cartridges, typically produced in very low numbers, or even one-offs like prizes for competitions, or only available for a limited time at promotional events, and then a look at various hardware bundles from around the world. All with the main unit, but including different games or accessories. Before seeing these, I didn't know so many choices existed, but it's because the vast majority of them are European. Then there's a selection of box art, featured under such categories like Most Unusual or Most Botched Box Art. At only 16 pages and focusing mostly on Japanese games, this is not a huge showcase of box art like the Nintendo 64 and GameCube Anthologies had in separate volumes. Technically, the box art has been featured in the software book already with each review, certainly the North American versions which take priority, though it would have been nice to more easily appreciate the detail on more of them by seeing them printed larger here. 14 pages showing off print advertising from back in the day ends the main content, and it closes with a list of all the Kickstarter backers. Look, there's my website, vgmaps.com. And so that is the hardware volume of the Super Nintendo Anthology. So ultimately, what do I think of the Super Nintendo Anthology? Well, I'll look at these books separately. First, the software volume. A more in-depth comparison of this and other similar books cataloging the Super NES library will be in a separate video, but I will say here that the software book does stand out by including all European and Japanese games, not just the highlights. However, this comprehensiveness in covering every title means very little space to go into any real depth in most games, usually just a single paragraph each. This book really needed to be larger. Also, a number of minor French mistranslations and factual errors stood out to me. And it's often not in correct alphabetical order, even when forgiving layout shuffles accommodating reviews of various sizes. So I would have to give the software volume a 4 out of 5. It's close to awesome, but the imperfections kept adding up to deduct the whole point. The hardware volume covers the not well-known Super NES origins and other Nintendo history in elaborate detail, comparisons to other consoles, which is unexpected but intriguing, techie discussion about graphics and audio, which I didn't get lost in, an almost exhaustive catalog of accessories, both official and unofficial, but oddly missing the Game Genie and North American Super Game Boy, interviews with the minds behind the Super FX chip and Street Racer, a catalog of special cartridges and hardware bundles, and small random assortments of box art and ads. The history and tech sections in particular I have not seen anywhere else on such an intricate level, so for that I can forgive the omission of a couple accessories, and their hardware volume gets a 5 out of 5. Just like the other anthologies by Geeks-Line Publishing, the Super Nintendo Anthology is very professionally put together and incredibly researched. The hardware volume is unrivaled, so that makes this a must-buy if you're curious about a bit more than just the games. The software volume is the only book I know of in English to feature every Japanese game, so if you're a fan of the Super Famicom specifically, this is a must-buy. As you will see when I compare multiple Super NES books, you've got a few other options if you're looking for a book of reviews of every North American Super NES game, but if you're okay with short reviews, then this might be just right for you. Averaging the software and hardware scores, the Super Nintendo Anthology as a whole gets a 4.5 out of 5. It can be purchased from Geeks-Line Publishing's website. Thanks for watching! I've done a number of video game book reviews, and have more yet to do, so please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. At the time of making this video, I'm still very low on subscribers, so by showing your support by hitting that subscribe button, it encourages me to keep on producing this content. You can also comment below about what you think of me, my channel, this book, or the Super NES in general. Like, what are your favorite games? Do you call it the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or Super Nintendo, or Super NES, or Super NES, or SNES, or SNES? Go comment, go nuts, and I'll see you in the next review. Later.